green to North Carolina's pines. They walk those miles with hope still in their minds. With every step, the pain was hard to bear. Yet through the tears, they chose to persevere. In Tennessee, they felt the river's cold embrace. Their spirit strong, no hardship could erase. The land of ancestors fading in their view, but their hearts held firm, love for what they knew. On the trail of tears where sorrow met the land, they carried dreams within a calloused hand. In Oklahoma, they found strength in pain, survived the journey through the snow and rain.
Yeah, I want to talk specifically about some of the work that we have done with this historic place, Browns Ferry. I first really became aware of Browns Ferry as I read about the story of the Civil War, the siege and battles for Chattanooga, the federal seizure of Browns Ferry in an amphibious pre-dawn attack in October of 1863 to open the Cracker Line. Kind of the first time I recognize it, and there are probably a couple of people in this room who are familiar with these images out of the old Golden Book of the Civil War, or the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War, David Greenspan's great pictorial depictions of the different battles. But as I studied to try to become a historian of the Civil War era, and attended college, and kind of through an adversarial relationship I had with my history department advisors, kind of made my own history degree, focusing on the mid-19th century. You know, I learned a little bit more about what happened at Browns Ferry, and how important it is, particularly as a Civil War site, to the Civil War action in the Chattanooga area. And I learned even more so about its importance once I came to work at Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park for the first time in 1982. I start to recognize kind of more of its history by even seeing the sign for Browns Ferry Road on the interstate. But that also, exploring in that area quickly begins to show me that there is a whole nother history to Browns Ferry, and that is the Cherokee history. Some of the evidence of that is the presence and story of what has long been known as Browns Ferry Tavern. But for a place-based historian, and that's what I kind of really think of myself as, you know, where did it happen on the ground? And that's true even when I first worked at the National Military Park, not as a historian, but as a federal law enforcement officer. But I was one interested in protecting historic sites. Browns Ferry was one of those places that you really couldn't fully appreciate because it wasn't a place you could go to. The actual ferry site. Browns Ferry Tavern, of course, you could see from the road, but it's not actually at the ferry site. And it was private property. Now, it was owned by the Franks, and most specifically in my time, Joan Franks, and she did periodically welcome historical groups to visit. But the Ferry site itself was privately owned. And particularly on the west side of the river. And while there was some publicly owned property on the Moccasin Bend side, the side from which the perspective of this image is taken, most of that public property on the Moccasin Bend side of Browns Ferry was the City of Chattanooga wastewater treatment plant. Excuse me, the Environmental Campus, which is their current branding. So, and it would be some time before I developed a more than customer service provider relationship with the sewer plant manager, and began to have some limited, albeit often smelly, access to the Moccasin Bend side of Browns Ferry. And there are people who have visited historic sites in the Chattanooga area, mostly Civil War related ones with me, who have been puzzled when we are going from one site to another and all of a sudden we turn into the sewer plant. And of course, I could gain some understanding and appreciation of the historic importance of Browns Ferry from maps and histories, like this snippet from one of the maps that was produced by the veterans of the Civil War battles around Chattanooga who created the National Military Park in the 1890s. But that understanding and appreciation was still really lacking the power of place, of being on the ground, because access was so difficult. But fortunately, the revival of the effort to preserve Moccasin Bend, and those of you all who were with us Monday evening on the Aquarium Plaza heard some of that. This is the revival of the effort in the 1980s after Mickey Robbins' aunt had made preserving Moccasin Bend an important part of Mickey and his wife's wedding. The revival of the Moccasin Bend preservation effort and the advent of the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail and the National Trail of Tears Association brought renewed research into the Browns Ferry story. Research that continues to this day, to this very day. And has now, over a little more than 2 decades, that research has begun to provide access to that place, to provide access to that power of place, because it has resulted in preservation and conservation of some of the actual ground at the site. And with that increasing access, it has rightly spurred still more research into all of the history that has occurred there, whether it is Cherokee history, early United States history, Civil War history. For this conference, more specifically, the history associated with the Whiteley Drain and Bell detachments of removal in 1838. But there is still a lot more to fully understand and to then allow us to really fully appreciate the place. And I want to speak this evening, or this afternoon primarily, about one of the research efforts that we have undertaken in the last few years to recover one of the roads to Browns Ferry. Now, in many ways, there should be several people up here making this presentation. It would be great if Dwayne King were here, It would be great if Mike Wren was here, but I won't begrudge him to an extended European trip for a wedding anniversary. Vicki, I should get you to come up here and help out. Dr. Major C.R. McCullough, Lawrence Alexander, Bob Hunter, Mickey Robbins, Jay Mills, Jack Baker. Where did Jack go to? So Max Snyder, Dave Hopkins, and the list could go on. This is not a project that one person can really undertake. It takes a team. It has taken a team, and it's going to take a lot more people as well. So I'm really here today standing on the shoulders of a lot of others, and in many ways, all of you all in the association and attending this conference today, because your commitment to being here and pushing forward the idea of telling the Cherokee removal story through the National Historic Trail has what, in many ways, spurred a lot of this research. But in that revival of the Save the Bend effort, and Tricia, hold up your computer. Oh, she's got the Subaru version on her water bottle. But in the revival of the Save the Bend effort of the 1980s and 1990s, back when I had to sneak out of the office at the end of the day, change my clothes in my car or truck, and then go to secret meetings in downtown Chattanooga because my employer was like this towards Moccasin Bend at the time. But in that process, a tract or parcel of land on the bend, what's identified there with the star there near the top center, it was identified. And while that property was owned by a manufacturing firm, and that tract of land had various uses in the second half of the 20th century, it was still felt that potentially that tract contained remains of the historic road to Browns Ferry. And it definitely was a portion of John Brown's 1819 reservation, which was strategically located straddling the neck of Moccasin Bend, the narrowest point, and literally placed down right where that crossing of the river was. Even if that 20th century use of the property left few historic resources intact, the tract could still be used to provide access to the river opposite and just downstream of historic Browns Ferry, so that you could have this view that is on the screen right now, and so that you could learn the story of Browns Ferry on the ground, and thereby have that story told in a much better way. The piece of property, as the Moccasin Bend National Archeological District was coming into existence, was acquired by the Trust for Public Lands, and it was transferred to the National Park Service for the Moccasin Bend National Archeological District after the district was officially created by legislation in February of 2003. With that transfer, now we could begin to think about this piece of property and its real potential. The problem is where in 98 acres of old tires and Chinese privet exactly might the remains of any surviving historic resources lie on that piece of property. Historic maps that georeference pretty well to the ground show the historic road. You can see it in the green oval there. Again, the map is from the Park Commission. The early days of the National Military Park in the 1890s, but there's also an even better map. As part of the Civil War actions around Chattanooga, the U.S. Army sent a team of Coast Survey members here to create some accurate mapping of the Chattanooga area, and you can see right here, the pontoon bridge going across the Tennessee River at Browns Ferry in late October, November, and early December of 1863. And you can see on the map the historic Browns Ferry Road going down to the river there. And that map actually georeferences pretty well to the real world. We also have that John Brown Reservation map and the language that goes along with Brown's Reservation, its meets and bounds. And those are helpful in locating particular points as well. That map can be georeferenced, particularly with its meets and bounds. And on the right, you see a more modern track map and the dashed lines that delineate that 640-acre tract that was set aside for John Brown in 1819. And how that reservation sits astride that narrow point on Moccasin Bend there, and right including the ferry and its approach on the Moccasin Bend side, or what with the Treaty of 1819 became the United States and Hamilton County, Tennessee. It stands out even more on that map because you can clearly see the river. You can see how Brown was very strategic in its location. And over the years here at the conference, we've heard about how others of these 1819 reservees were very strategic in where they placed their reservations as well. We heard about that last evening about Walker and his reservation at what became Calhoun. Believe it or not, some of the boundary lines of Brown's 1819 reservation are still in use today. This is one of them. This line of poles that runs down right here that actually hold, well, they do several things, provide utilities for one, but they're also poles that support some nets. This is a golf course. And this is the end of the driving range, and to reduce the number of golf balls that go onto the environmental campus, they have a big net there. But you can stop on Moccasin Bend Road here, as I have done, and sight down that line, and you are looking at the southern line of the Brown Reservation. If you go up the road a little bit further turn in or stop here at the entrance to this river service complex that is back the road here. The fence line that runs right down here is one of the northern boundaries of the Brown Reservation. Surveyed in 1819, still in use to this very day. And then right close to I-24, you have another boundary line that this presently empty lot right here, but the buildings here, the property line between it is part of the northern line as well. It's actually this short section right there. And so that is helpful because this map also shows the historic road. And when you use the meets and bounds and do some rough scaling, this starts to help get you some idea of where the road might be. There are also aerial photographs. This one from 1947 of that 98-acre tract, and the road would have arced across it to go down to the actual ferry crossing down here. And this aerial is useful. And as I said, many of these sources are good enough to be overlaid with the real world. And so here's the Coast Survey map, primarily geo-referenced to the real world, and you can see the Browns Ferry Road highlighted there, angling across the property and going down to the riverbank here. Again, this is 98 acres of old tires and Chinese privet. So where might the old road be? Well, fortunately, we have some other resources today as well. And we saw a little bit that with Brett's presentation a few minutes ago. We have LIDAR, which is kind of scanning. My shorthand for this, Brett would probably winch at my description of it, but take your desktop scanner at home, take the lid of it off, turn it upside down and bolt it on the bottom of an airplane, and then fly the airplane back and forth in a really controlled fashion over the ground, and it literally is scanning the earth. And it will peel away the vegetation and give us a view of the surface of the earth. And the LIDAR for that 98-acre tract shows old farm lanes, which have now become service roads on the property. You can see another one here. You can particularly see the drainages. You can see a big drainage that comes down through here and flows into the Tennessee River. There's another one right down here. And guess what? The old road runs on the top of basically the watershed between those two drainages, runs on the high ground between them, right down through here. There's also a stock pond out there. Fortunately, it doesn't hold any water today, but and so you can overlay the LIDAR with the Coast Survey map, and you can then start to see again where the historic road would be. But if you look real carefully at the LIDAR, you'll notice that little diagonal line right there? What is that? And then there's a little more diagonalness in this area and here as well. And it doesn't stand out too well on this slide, but there's a thin blue line, and it actually represents the historic road. Is the LIDAR telling us there might be some road trace remaining out there amongst all the Chinese privet? So from the mapping, GPS coordinates were created, and Max Snyder and I went out there, and some of you all will remember Shelley Andrews. She watched, but Max and I waded off into the Chinese privet. And following the directions of his GPS, we began to hang pink ribbons in the trees. We tried not to hang them on Chinese privet, but we had to hang a lot on Chinese privet, began to mark that historic route. Some places the Chinese privet was so thick, literally, the only way we got through it was to turn around, lean against it, and then force one foot through it and down onto the ground and literally work your way that far in it and then do the same thing with your next foot and break your way through. But, I'm sorry?
Why did you cut it?
I had my loppers and I was cutting Chinese privet the whole time, but there was so much to cut. And yes, it would have been nice to have taken a sling blade and cut it, but this Chinese privet was 10 and 15 and 20 feet tall, and it had some of the big stuff, with 2 and 3 inches in diameter across. What I was actually cutting with the loppers was enough to then be able to see from one ribbon to another ribbon along that line. But even after doing that, we could start to see that on the ground there was a subtle change in elevation. That hump, that diagonal line that appeared on the LiDAR. Now, having our flagging down through the privet, there were some places where it was thin enough that we could see a long enough distance, and as we then looked and walked along it, we could see the ground slope off just a little bit, where hopefully there was still that old trace of the road. And so 2 very brave souls were hired to clear the Chinese privet along that line that we had flagged, and this is the product of their work. So.
Good question. Why would you have a hump instead of a swale?
Well, you'll see that in a minute here. So in this case, you're correct. In most cases, the trace of a historic road is going to be where it is worn into the surface. But you'll see why this turns out to be the other way around in just a minute. So as part of this, Lawrence Alexander's archaeological firm, Alexander Archeological Consulting. Now, Lawrence has deservedly had a fine career in archaeology and anthropology and has retired. This was before that retirement, and his firm undertook an archaeology study at the site. We first made use of metal detectors. We had a relationship with a group of amateur archaeologists of metal detectors who would not necessarily fall into that category that Brett used better language for a few minutes ago. These fellows are real historians themselves. And they are real experts at using their equipment. And under the supervision of myself and the archaeologist, they searched this now cleared corridor. And we are initially concentrating where the LiDAR showed us that greatest evidence of a potential road. And here are the hits that they got. And we're talking about an old road, and a road that was used extensively in the Civil War to supply a Union army that was cooped up in Chattanooga. And so what might be things you would find along that old road? Horseshoes, mule shoes, wagon parts. Believe it or not, we only found a couple of Civil War mini-balls. Mostly we found transportation-related items. Now, most likely, they're Civil War. But they could be much earlier, because particularly after the advent of machine-made shoes, it becomes very difficult to date a horse or mule shoe. Once machine-made shoes become possible, they don't really change much over a really long time period. But the fact that we found transportation artifacts was beneficial. It helped us say that we're seeing traces of where an old road would be. And so to test the hypothesis, we looked into the ground. We put a backhoe trench across the axis of the road at right angles at one point, and then carefully cleaned up that trench. And we could begin to see in the profile of the trench, we could begin to see these different layers that you can see in this image. And if you will notice, there are two places where we have kind of these semicircular depressions in the profile. There's one there and one there. And then notice this one right here, the kind of vertical lines there. I'll come back to that in just a minute. The semicircular depression, it's not called out here as well, but you can see it right there. We also used ground penetrating radar. This was not a great site, however, for ground penetrating radar. In Brett's presentation a few minutes ago, where did you see Chet Walker using his geophysical investigation equipment? Okay, uplands. And what was absent in those pictures of Chet working? Trees. Yeah. All of those geophysical techniques work best on a golf course. On open ground, not in the trees. So with ground penetrating radar, we were only able to do really small windows where we could get grids laid out to then be able to get the parallel tracks that you need of the ground penetrating radar. But we're trying to make use of as many different techniques as possible. But as we begin to excavate and examine the profile more specifically, we also start to find some really hard surface. This material right here. And there's some little white specks that are kind of visible in it there at the edge. Here's excavated all the way down, and you can see that layer in the profile right there. Well, what we had discovered was at least two clear surfaces of this road over time. And so in these drawings, these profiles of our backhoe trench, you could see the subsoil, and those semicircular depressions in that profile were logs that had been split in half and laid down, puncheons as they were called, laid down along the axis of the historic or of the road, and then other material, either other logs that had been split or literally sawn timber, depending upon exactly what time you're talking about, laid across those as the actual road bed. This is a planked road at some point, or at least corduroyed road. Corduroy is to laying small poles across those stringers. Now you might say, well, okay, Ogden, you only done one backhoe trench, and so you get those two little semicircles. How do you know that they were puncheons? Well, when logs with their bark still on them rot away, as the cambium layer deteriorates, it leaves some of the minerals that it is carrying up and down the trees in the soil, and you get a little white kind of ring or ghosting where the bark met the, or in the Cambion layer, or where it had been. And guess what we saw in both of those little semicircles? That little white ghost there. So, and then on top of that layer of material with the white specks in it was several layers, and we could detect clearly 3, but probably more, several layers of very carefully selected sand, clay, and very small gravel. Gravel that had been screened, and some of it was broken, suggesting that it was even broken up specifically for that purpose. But regardless of now the gravel is probably from the Civil War use of the road in 1863, when the Union Army had thousands of man-hours available for that type of work. The gravel also spread over basically 2 lanes. The planks, or the corduroy road underneath of it, was basically 1 lane. And plank roads were only planked on 1 lane. And if 2 wagons met on the planked road, the lighter wagon had to give way to the heavier wagon. I can only imagine the arguments that developed when 2 wagons met one another on a planked road. The planks were under basically if you were going away from the ferry, it would have been on the right-hand side of the road. But that very carefully selected sand, gravel, and clay mixture was over the full width of the road. So now we've got the maps, we've got the LIDAR, and now we also have archaeology that shows us the actual remains of an old road. Now, is that lowest level, the puncheon support, or the puncheon stringers and that planked road, is that the oldest road there? Does that road date back to Cherokee removal, or does it date back to even earlier in Cherokee history? That we can't necessarily say. It is possible that where we sampled the road remains, that all of the earlier evidence of the road had been obliterated when that plank surface was put down. At least in that point, we know that the earliest trace of the road is that planked or corduroyed surface. And again, this is right along this initial historic stretch of the road. This archaeological work gave us the confidence that we are looking in the right place, that between the historic maps, georeferencing them, the LIDAR, that there is indeed historic road remains there. We subsequently did a little more archaeology out there at 2 other locations, one down here in this area, and another about the middle section here. In the lower area here, we did not find any evidence of the road. 20th century impacts clearly had obliterated whatever remained of it there once we had our trenches in there. In the kind of the middle section, we found that clay, sand, and gravel mix, but it had been clearly disturbed. And that happened to be right in the area near the gas pipeline and 2 overhead power lines. So the installation of those facilities probably disrupted those remains. But this work that we did do was enough confirmation of the historic sources to allow us to create the Browns Ferry Road Trail on this 98-acre piece of property with a small trailhead along Browns Ferry Road. And today, you can walk 0.6 of a mile along this trail that we have developed. The first part of it, actually along that corridor where the road remains are most, or survive most intact. And this trail will take you down to the banks of the Tennessee River, opposite historic Browns Ferry, and allow you to look across the river at the notch in the ridge line there that is so distinctive for the Browns Ferry location. There are some waysides along there today. But the research and the preservation at this site continues today. The American Battlefield Trust has now protected 15 acres on the other side of the river. As you look across, it'll be the hill on the right-hand side of the image. And they have now transferred that property to National Park Partners-Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Moccasin Bend. And the early phases of developing a more accessible visitor experience to the west side has begun. And the American Battlefield Trust has not ended their preservation effort in this area. It's not been announced fully as a campaign yet for them, but they have a deal with the owner of the next 30 acres of land downstream on the ridge line. So if you ever see literature from the American Battlefield Trust early next year, you'll see their campaign for the next 30 acres at Browns Ferry. But all of this work has allowed for a much greater appreciation, but there's still a lot to be done, right, Vicki? We still have to develop a much greater understanding and appreciation of John Brown, the businessman, to really fully appreciate the importance of this site to Cherokee history. But it's now one that I think you can better appreciate because now you can, and for a section, walk on the actual alignment of the old road and yourself be on the way to Browns Ferry. So, all right.
They carry dreams.